Welcome to the Left Unsaid. This is episode 10. It's a special Father's Day edition, and this Father's Day, we are firing up the grill, and we are tossing some American myths over the coals.
It's about the only time we fired up the grill on Father's Day as a vegetarian family.
Well, that's true.
Actually, I don't want that personal information going out into the world. So.
That we're vegetarian?
Well, you shouldn't have signed the release. Brought to you, of course, here by your father-in-chief, Patrick McElwee, as well as the mom over there.
Mom-in-chief, Meg, and I don't know. Are you child-in-chief? I guess as the eldest.
Child-in-chief. We'll give him that.
All right. He's not really a child anymore.
Okay.
Ish.
Awkward adolescent in chief.
I don't know about that one.
Not that awkward. Once again, Finn and I are recovering from a long week of filming.
I'm honestly surprised you two are sitting here. You've had like virtually no rest over the last week and a half. All of your weekends have been filled to the brim with political activities.
Yeah, but for us, like that's kind of restful, you know. Some people rest by lounging and sun tanning, and Finn and I were up in D.C. We got to roam the halls of Congress with a camera for a few days. We ran into Medea Benjamin and CodePink. Got to see the bravery of the women of CodePink and also some of the men, one man, in action.
Yeah, we followed them around with the camera as they confronted a lot of elected members of Congress. It was pretty cool to see. We were there when they staked out Pete Hegseth and gave him a stern talking to.
Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth.
Yep.
They're brave. I mean, I got to say, like, I saw them also out on the National Mall climbing all over the military vehicles that Trump had parked out there. This was, of course, the week leading up to Trump's, what I thought was going to be Trump's big military parade. I mean, he'd hung out with Kim Jong-il or whatever his name is, and it seemed like he really had some big ambitions for his 79th birthday. I got to say, the parade itself just didn't look that spectacular.
It looked pretty boring to me. I mean, you all left the day before it happened. You came back home here to North Carolina, and just watching it on TV, it's like, wow. That's just a lot of people marching. They didn't have anybody dancing. I didn't see too many marching bands. I'm sure there were some, but it was very bland. It was just group after group just coming down in their uniforms. And
small groups.
Yeah.
They don't even march in lockstep, you know?
Yeah, their marching was not even very good. I got to say, they're slacking.
I mean, I approve. That's how I would march were I them. I think that's the kind of military I want. I want sort of like a kind of a loungy, just kind of just strolling down the street, each one to his own. I think there's something very American about that. I do predict that we're about to get a lot more ceremonial units in every branch of the U.S. military, just so someone like Trump can, you know, have that like pageantry of the authoritarian lockstep march with color coordination, et cetera, et cetera.
So was it eerie, y'all, walking along the National Mall with all these military vehicles?
I don't know. What do you think, Finn? I would say, again, lackadaisical. You know, there was like one tank, you know, they put a couple of helicopters out there, but it wasn't that significant, to be honest. I mean, mostly the mall was just covered with good DC liberals playing softball.
Oh, yeah.
around these machines of war. Yeah, so we'll be showing you more footage from what happened to us in DC because we got some great stuff for the documentary, of course. Finn got a hug from somebody very special, but that's going to be saved for the big release. We got to hook you with something, you know.
He's still basking in that hug.
Oof, what a hug. That was quite a hug. So we didn't get to stay in DC for the military parade itself, but we decided to come home because DC wasn't actually going to be the site of big protests. But back here in Chapel Hill, we all went to a nice No Kings protest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What'd you guys think?
What'd you think of the big tent protest, Finn?
I don't know. I mean, it's obviously good that so many people got out, but I guess we live in a kind of upper middle class suburban area. So
here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Yeah, the people that came out to our local protests weren't exactly what you might call experienced protesters. You know, it was a lot of like the United States defends freedom, and so do we defend the United States. There was a lot of institution defending going on, which I'm not a huge fan of. You know, I think it needs to be a movement that builds something new rather than just seeks to return to something that we had before, which already wasn't working for a lot of Americans and people around the globe, honestly.
But was working for a certain kind of American, right? Like someone who makes a certain amount of money. You can see why the politics might just be, hey, that was working pretty well. That neoliberalism, like it was fine. Like, why are you all complaining? Almost. So it's a position of privilege. What we saw at our King's protests was someone dressed up as George Washington. A lot of people completely decked out in red, white, and blue. Which, no shade, lots of flags. It's not really my thing. If you know me personally, I'm like not super into red, white, and blue dressing.
Glorifying slaveholders.
Right.
Not super into that.
The parents stepping on eggshells here, and Finn's just like, yeah, exactly. This kind of honoring without a critical inquiry of what America's past actually was and continues to be for a whole lot of working class people and people less fortunate than the more wealthy suburban liberal class.
Yeah, and I would say for like seasoned protest heads like ourselves, it was a bit of culture shock. I've got some amazing audio of some of the chants that were led by the folks at the local march. Some very strong language, I have to say. I don't know if it would be family friendly. Let's put that on right here.
Donald Trump, he ain't a king. He's just a greedy ding-a-ling.
Ding-a-ling, my goodness. My goodness. What has political culture come to these days?
I don't know. I don't know how the police are allowing these rioters to use such abusive language,
But, part of me thinks, like, if we're going to have a mass revolution, which at the moment we definitely need a coalition to beat the fascists that are coming to power. So, like, I guess this is what it looks like, at least here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm sure it's very different in different places, but we are like one of the bastions of the professional middle class PMC culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you go down to Durham, it's about 30 minutes away from us. It's a more working class city. You'll get a lot more eat the rich chants going there. We went down to the last protest over there.
Oh, yeah, the hands-off protest.
Yeah, they had some pretty good energy. But yeah, here, there's not too much of that. But, no shade. I'm glad these people showed out to do something, even if maybe clearly it wasn't their favorite thing to do. But I guess the other thing I'm annoyed at is that I kid you not, this was a sign I saw. It was like, resist fascism, vote blue. That was a sign. And just like, if it's fascism, you're not getting out of it by voting.
Right. Well, and also I noticed that one of the speakers at the march, I mean, they had all the local Democratic notables, maybe not all of them, but they had several Democratic notables speaking. And one of the local notables who came out was State Representative Alan Bwanzi, our local Democrat in the North Carolina State Legislature. And Finn, you've got some history there because he came to speak to your high school. And you guys came prepared with some questions that I don't think he was prepared to answer about his votes on free speech around Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, he voted for North Carolina to adopt the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, which includes calling the state of Israel a racist endeavor and also comparing contemporary Israeli policies to that of the Nazis anti-Semitic, which is, of course, ridiculous.
And this bill that he voted for basically linked criticism of Israel to hate crimes in North Carolina. So it's a pretty dangerous escalation at a time when we were already seeing police violence deployed against pro-Palestinian or anti-genocide protesters. And of course, it was before Trump got elected, but now we're really seeing the weaponization of all of that so-called anti-Semitism legislation being deployed against not just anti-genocide protesters, but potentially a much larger segment of the politically engaged population of the United States.
Yeah, but anyways, I asked him this question about why he voted for this bill at the time Joe Biden was president, if he had called on the Democratic leadership to stop the genocide in Gaza. And he didn't honestly really have a good answer to either. He was just like, oh, yeah, well, like, I don't think that you can, like, prosecute people based on that bill or whatever. He said it was something he was concerned about, which is like, if you don't agree with us, then why did you vote for it? But
right. And of course, we know why I voted for it because the conventional wisdom at every level of politics in the United States at the current moment and for the last, I don't know how many decades, is that you have to kowtow to Israel no matter what. One other thing I noticed at the protests is that we had the only no war with Iran sign, which that really did surprise me.
Yeah, it did.
Especially given some of the politics around that back in like 2005 during the high tide of the Iraq occupation, when there was a large contingent of fighting liberals who were worried and against a war with Iran.
You did a whole tour. You organized a whole tour.
We did. Yeah, we took an author, Stephen Kinzer, who's written a great book about the coup in Iran in 1953. We took him on a tour, I think, of 30 or 40 events across the country. Mm-hmm. We had not just the hardcore left on our side, but there were a lot of liberals who were also concerned about a war with Iran. So I'm hopeful that the lack of signage worried about a war with Iran at the present moment doesn't represent some kind of permanent split. I mean, I absolutely am clear that the left feels like it's difficult to be in coalition with the liberals based on what has happened over the last year and a half in Gaza with Biden full-throatedly supporting a genocide. But I hope there's not like a counter reaction of liberals just knee-jerk identifying with Israel, perhaps because they don't like being criticized by the left here domestically.
I mean, I think they would do it anyways, right? Like, I don't think that's a good reason why we shouldn't criticize them for supporting a genocide. And clearly, you know that. But yeah, some people near me tried to start a chant at this protest for Palestine. There were like some isolated groups here or there that like had signs related to Palestine. But, most of the liberals weren't that into chanting in general compared to, other protests I've been at. But especially not this one, only like us and a few other people here and there picked up the chant. And that was pretty disheartening because, it's one of the most gruesome things that Donald Trump is complicit in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And still no significant amounts of aid reaching the starving people.
Mm-hmm. But, one of the reasons why we do these big tent protests and we show up with our signs is because it's an educational moment as well. A lot of these folks are, an elderly neighbor or people who may not have been out to protest recently, who may be consuming corporate news media, and to see a sign that says, remember, fascism didn't start with Trump, or to see a sign that says, killing kids is not self-defense. Seeing the signs might break through a little bit, might cause them to go home and Google or to figure something out.
Yeah,
so you never know.
Absolutely. I mean, these protests are as much the people taking part of them as people watching from the outside or something. And so I do think, at least for us, we'll keep showing up with our no war in Iran signs, with our stop bombing kids in Gaza signs, and have as many conversations with people there as we can. Clearly, there's a lot of education on Iran to be had. It's maybe time for us to turn our attention to what's actually going on now between Israel and Iran. So Israel launched what was billed as a potential decapitation attack on Iran. They seem to become very fond of this in the Netanyahu war cabinet. Similar to what they did against Hezbollah with the pager attack, where they tried to take out the chain of command of Hezbollah's militia in Lebanon. They launched attacks with, it looks like a combination of missiles and drones that they had smuggled across the border into Iran, similar, again, to what the Ukrainians recently did in Russia, having smuggled drones inside of Russia and then launching a coordinated attack on some of their military installations there. The Israelis attacked some nuclear sites, and when we say nuclear sites, we should be clear that these are civilian nuclear sites where they are enriching uranium, as they are allowed to do under nuclear agreements that they're a party to, specifically the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which does allow Iran the right to enrich uranium for its civilian nuclear power usage.
It's also worth pointing out that Israel is and has been in violation of and has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have nuclear bombs that are not regulated by the international bodies, that Iran does cooperate with.
That's right. And so Israel attacked these nuclear enrichment sites. They attacked some other military sites. And they also did these pinpointed assassinations of generals and nuclear scientists inside of Iran, sometimes smashing through the walls of their apartments, killing them, and not only them, but also their families, in many cases, neighbors. And this was billed as a huge strategic success. But since then, we've seen night after night missiles flying back and forth between Iran and Israel. And it looks as though we might have moved into a phase of this war that is a shooting war. And Israel did not at all eliminate Iran's ability to retaliate. Now, first thing we got to be clear about is this is an illegal war of aggression.
Absolutely.
Israel calls it preemptive, but Iran was in no way about to attack Israel. In fact, they were negotiating. They were participating in peace negotiations between Israel, the United States, and themselves. In fact, today, the day we're recording on Father's Day on Sunday, there was another round scheduled, and Trump had been making all kinds of noise, like the United States was optimistic that there were going to be a breakthrough in the talks. The United States wasn't directly involved in the attack on Iran, but they have since been involved in defensive operations, helping to protect Israel from being hit by the Iranian retaliatory missiles.
And I will say, the U.S. is never really not involved in anything Israel does because, they supply most of their equipment, a lot of the funding for their military, and a lot of training as well. And, if the U.S. really wanted Israel to not strike Iran, Israel couldn't have struck Iran. Clearly the U.S. is deeply complicit in what Israel did.
Yeah, as President Trump himself put it in a tweet, Israel used beautiful weapons from the United States in their attack.
Another reason why I hate the word beautiful now.
I mean, it's also unclear the extent to which the Trump administration was pretending to engage in negotiations and pretending to be optimistic about them in order to lull Iran into a false sense of security before this unilateral, unprovoked attack.
Right. And what makes it even more shocking is that it's pretty widely known, even in the U.S. intelligence community, that Iran was not developing a military nuclear weapon.
Yeah, we can go to the testimony here 2 months ago of Tulsi Gabbard, who's Trump's director of national intelligence, testifying that the IC, which is short for the intelligence community, believes that Iran has no nuclear program, is not close to developing a nuclear weapon, and in fact has had no nuclear program since at least 2003.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. The IC continues to monitor closely if Tehran decides to reauthorize its nuclear weapons program.
And so despite that, the supposed fact that Iran is about to develop nuclear weapons is the justification that the Israeli government is leaning on to provide a veneer of legitimacy to their unprovoked attack. It's worth going back in time and taking a look at the history of these claims that Iran is about to produce a nuclear weapon. You can go back 40 years ago to find Israel's first claims that Iran was 3 to 5 years from producing a nuclear weapon. But even more recently, with Netanyahu himself in his political career, he first warned that the Iranian government was about to produce a nuclear weapon back in 1992, 33 years ago. And here in the show notes, I'll just drop this graphic tracking the claims about Iranian nuclear weapons by Netanyahu over the years. And we can just see that this has been a recurring feature of his politics. And, it reminds me of like these religious cults who say the world is about to end. They give you a specific date. The specific date comes and goes. And somehow the religious cult continues on reinterpreting, I guess, whatever data they have further into the future. But certainly claim by Netanyahu that Iran is about to have nuclear weapons shouldn't be taken as evidence that it is. But once again, we have the double standard that international law applies to everybody except Israel. And even the response of the Europeans, we've been talking a lot about sort of the tide shift of Europe with respect to how Israel is treating the Palestinians in Gaza. Well, take a look now at the releases they've been coming out with. Just as an example, take a look at this German statement condemning Iran for its, quote, indiscriminate attack on Israeli territory.
For real.
Crazy.
Just completely crazy that their condemnation is reserved for Iran, who is, of course, retaliating to an attack on their territory by Israel while they were negotiating.
And it shows just how weak this Israel has the right to defend itself line has always been. And, it's just blatant mental shield that breaks down at the slightest touch.
And just the way in which they think we're all such sheep. I mean, it's just worth reminding ourselves and repeating the lessons. All of us alive, as George W. Bush claimed that they had to invade and occupy Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction, WMD, hammered into our brains by the mainstream media. Clearly lies at the time, clearly shown to be lies by the fact that they found no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Right.
The claims of these governments cannot be taken seriously. They must provide evidence, and of course, they don't even feel the need to come up with anything.
Yeah, not to mention the many, many U.S. Congress members who've said basically the same thing.
Most Republicans, there's a few holdouts like Tom Massey, pretty impressive Republican, refusing to go along with the war in Iran train. And the Democratic camp, I would say, is split in half. And in the mainstream U.S. press, I was just watching some of these channels like CNN, also MSNBC, and they were using words like stunning, incredible, extraordinary to refer to the Israeli attack on Iran. One quote that kept coming up over and over was this one: the total intelligence, domination, and penetration. I mean, they just love this kind of language.
Wow.
The military language of adversaries and so on. Like it's a chess game.
Well, totally ignoring the environmental impact of these kind of strikes.
Yeah, you see the big fires.
Huge fires striking the oil refineries or whatever. I mean,
absolutely.
what a catastrophe. And just call it stunning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Incredible.
And just nothing about the human consequences on the Iranian side. We do hear about the human consequences now that there's missiles falling in places like Tel Aviv and Haifa inside Israel.
We do, yeah, of course.
But again, the double standard about which casualties get mentioned. Mm-hmm. I will say there is some acknowledgement of the recent history, especially by Democrats, of the nuclear agreement that was negotiated under President Obama that Trump tore up at the very beginning of his first term back in 2016. The Iranians rightfully say, hey, we had an agreement not to enrich uranium past a certain point, past a point where it could be developed into a nuclear weapon, because nuclear weapons require a higher level of uranium enrichment than civilian use for power plants. And Trump tore it up. The Europeans could have stepped in and said, okay, well, we're going to protect Iran. Despite the United States pulling out of the agreement, we'll protect them from sanctions. We'll hold up the agreement from our end. And they completely failed to do that. I would be so surprised if Iran doesn't make the political decision now that they do need a nuclear weapon. And that's a tragedy because...
Right, it really is.
Because nuclear weapons are a scourge on the face of the earth. And the more they get spread around the world, the less possible we'll ever be able to put that genie back into the bottle. I will note too on the Democratic side, the Democrats try to play this game where they accept the basic assumptions, like the basic narrative, the right-wing narrative of what's happening on the global stage, but they inexplicably deny the solutions. President Obama did this all the time, where he would tell people, oh, Islam is not the reason for terror. Like, don't condemn Islam. It's Islamophobic to say that Islam is the cause of terrorism. But he could never say the real reasons that terrorism was happening because of the political underpinnings, the objections because of the U.S. empire.
Right, the empire, neocolonialism.
And so the Democrats are just left without a real explanation, and they leave a lot of people who don't follow this regularly, who can't substitute in a critique of U.S. empire that the Democrats are leaving out, to say, well, okay, why is terrorism happening then? The Republicans tell me it's Islam. The Democrats just say it's not just Islam, that's racist, but they don't give me any real explanation for why it's happening then. Because, of course, they can't critique the U.S. empire. No. Well, we had another example of that here with Hakeem Jeffries, who's widely seen as the leader of the Democrats in D.C., as the House minority leader of the Democrats. And he says, quote, "We certainly believe that Iran should never be allowed to become nuclear capable. They are an enemy, not just to Israel, but to the United States and to the free world. But we also want to see a reduction in hostilities." Why, man? If they're an enemy to the free world, dude, like, attack them, drive them off the face of the earth. They're an enemy to the free world. Like, it doesn't compute.
Right. And this is why, the MAGA folks will call this stuff out.
Yeah, I think to a lot of people, they see that and it just looks, I don't know, it looks weak. Or maybe Hakeem Jeffries is an enemy to the free world. He recognizes it, but he wants a reduction in hostilities. And it's, of course, total BS. Again, the Iranian regime has no nuclear program by the assessment of the U.S. government itself, hasn't since 2003, and was in negotiations to restart an agreement that the United States unilaterally pulled out of. I mean, it's completely upside down.
Well, Finn has to sign off here to go hang out with some friends.
All right, we'll let you off the hook, Finn. See you, buddy. And not to say, of course, that this means that we're supporting the Iranian government itself. The Iranian government uses these flare-ups between them and Israel internally to Iran to sort of solidify their own legitimacy. And by all reports, it's working. There's a real rally around the flag effect happening inside of Iran. So any internal resistance to the Islamic government of Iran has been weakened by this.
Yeah. So do you want to go into a little deeper history here between Israel and Iran, just the region in general? Like why are we here? Sure.
I mean, it's a complicated history. But yeah, it is worth knowing, like, why do we have an Islamic government in Iran? Well, a lot of that goes back to 1953 when the United States and the United Kingdom overthrew a democratically elected leader, Mossadegh, who was a democratic secular leader of Iran. And the reason they did it was because he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil.
Right. He was a bit of a democratic socialist, let's call him.
Yeah, I would say even a very light democratic socialist. More of a nationalist, a secular nationalist.
Yeah.
And it happened in 1953 at a time when the Cold War was really starting to ramp up and policymakers no longer tolerated any kind of nationalism in the third world. And so they overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh and they replaced him with the Shah of Iran, who was a dictator, who had good relationships with Israel, recognized Israel. Well, that state of affairs lasted for 25 years or so until the Iranians had enough of this dictator and they overthrew him and it was replaced by the Islamic faction of that revolution. And they've been in power ever since. And part of their power, part of the legitimacy of that government is its opposition to Israel, which it calls the Zionist entity.
And the U.S. empire.
Exactly. Since that revolution, there's been all kinds of tensions between Iran, which is an Islamic government with a certain flavor of Islam called Shia, and the Arab countries that lie between Israel and Iran, such as Iraq and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, some of which have been secular at times. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was governed by a secular ideology, or Islamic themselves, but under the Sunni flavor of Islam, such as in Saudi Arabia. You know, Iraq and Iran fought a brutal war in the 80s, where Iraq was supported by Saudi Arabia and many of the other Arab states. But Iran's power in the region actually grew quite a bit as a result of the United States invading and occupying Iraq, because Iraq is a country that's split between Sunnis and Shia, and many of the Shia, not all by any means, inside of Iraq had some alliance with Iran. And so you saw over the course of the U.S. occupation, which was a complete debacle, destroyed all kinds of infrastructure inside of Iraq, including the government infrastructure, led to rebellions among the Sunni population that led to ISIS, this radical Islamic political group that took over a large swath of Iraq and Syria, destabilized Syria. During all this time, Iran sort of steadily built up its infrastructure across its border into the eastern side of Iraq, installing things like power lines, communications networks, and so on, and really increased the amount of influence that Iran had in the region as a whole. That was seen as an unforgivable offense by Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel, who conspired over a long time to try to oppose Iran's influence. Iran had friends like the Syrian government under Assad, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and yes, indeed, Hamas inside of Gaza. So a lot of what's been happening has been proxy wars by Israel and others against Iranian allies in the region. Interestingly, back in 2023, China brokered the reestablishment of relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iran under the new crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, which to me raises the question of like what's going to happen with Saudi Arabia in this Israel-Iran war, although it seems that they have been assisting Israel in defensive maneuvers against Iranian missiles coming through. So my guess is mostly because of their strong ties to the U.S. that Saudi Arabia is weighing in more on the side of Israel than on the side of Iran. But it could have all gone a different way. There were definitely voices. I mean, back when we were organizing the No War in Iran tour, there seemed the real possibility that the United States could reorient and find within Iran reformers. There were democratic reformers and the seeds of a secular society there, and a lot of interest in common, especially at the time, the interest of solidifying the governability of Iraq so the United States didn't have to occupy them forever. But that wasn't the road that was taken. Instead, we find ourselves in a shooting war between Iran and Israel with no real idea of how far this is going to go, of what the long-term consequences would be. It's a reckless gamble. And I think the biggest bet of the Netanyahu government is that they're going to be able to draw the United States in.
Well, and also perhaps another reason why Israel just went ahead with this is also to draw attention away from Gaza and the flack that they're getting for all of their war crimes there and the genocide that's happening. I know that around the same time, perhaps a day or so before, they destroyed the telecommunications line in Gaza, and there was a complete internet blackout there, pretty much, unless you had an eSIM. Even having an eSIM did not mean that you had enough reception to upload a video to social media. People weren't able to call family members in different areas to check and see if they're okay. And from what it seems, there was an even further intensification of bombardment in Gaza as this internet blackout happened. And sadly, it seems that, again, around the same time frame as the stuff in Iran is happening, Israel has imposed a total siege on the West Bank.
The West Bank, of course, being the other major population center for Palestinians and a territory occupied by Israel illegally in contravention of UN resolutions on it. You know, Gideon Levy, who's an Israeli journalist writing in Haaretz, points out that this is likely to overshadow what's happening to the Palestinians, which is very sad indeed. Well, Meg, we've lost our 16-year-old, and maybe it's time for us to start bringing it to a close. But we did promise to try to have some good news towards the end of our podcast.
Okay. Do you want to talk about Zohran again?
Yeah, let's talk about Zohran. Zohran. And here in episode 10, which I think is in and of itself good news, the fact that we got to episode 10.
Yeah, sure. Uh-huh.
So keep on listening. If you haven't hit like and subscribe wherever you're listening, give us a rating, give us a review, and come to the leftunsaid.net and sign up for our mailing list if you haven't done that already. But yeah, let's talk about Zohran. So Zohran Mamdani is running for mayor of New York City and looks like he may even have pulled ahead, at least in one poll that I saw, of Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York who resigned in disgrace after being accused of sexual harassment by many women.
Real upstanding sleazebag, you know?
So Zohran's just so amazing. I mean, I heard somebody saying, "Is this?" It seems as though the left may have found its Obama figure, and
yeah,
I feel like it could be true. I mean, he's got a real gift for this politics.
He really
stuff.
does. His eyes light up. Yeah, he's a light in the darkness for sure. And his appeal is that he relentlessly focuses on the needs of working people.
Yeah, he's got a real nice message in a city we can afford.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And a very clear message. We learned the lesson from losing a lot of working class voters to the Trump movement. The simplicity of how their message comes across, you know, just hammering the same things over. Of course, for them, it's the scapegoating of fascism. Oh, it's the immigrants who are taking your jobs and what, you know, hammering it over and over again, you know, the same message. And Zohran is really good at sticking to his economic populism. And he talks about wanting people to live in dignity. And I love that.
Yeah, and he ties it into like a broader narrative. It's not just like a policy here, a policy there. Mm-hmm. But you see like the arc of his vision. And I think that really appeals to people. You know, he's talking about city-run grocery stores to bring down the price of groceries. He's talking about free bus fares and rent freezes and the city actually investing in building housing for people.
But he also says, which I think is what is giving him a huge amount of clout with so many people, is he can very honestly say, look, I do not take money. I don't take big money from anybody. I'm not beholden to the Israeli government. I'm not beholden to wealthy landlords. I'm not beholden to DoorDash. All these folks are throwing money at Andrew Cuomo, for example. But he can honestly say, look, the only people I speak for are New Yorkers.
I mean, you mentioned the Israeli government, which might sound out of place there, but what's been surprising is, maybe not surprising, but instructive yet again, is as he's risen up in the polls, it looks more and more likely that he's going to beat the guy everybody thought was going to win, Andrew Cuomo. You see the elite of New York City coming out and just incessantly asking him about his support for the state of Israel, a foreign government, despite the fact that he's going to be the mayor of New York. He's not going to have any kind of foreign policy responsibilities, but they're constantly asking him, does he support Israel? Will he travel to visit Israel? Quite amazing in itself.
I mean, it's jaw-dropping.
Especially, New York is 10% Jewish people, not all of whom are Zionists.
Isn't it also 9% Muslim?
Yeah, it's 9% Muslim.
Yeah.
They never ask him anything about how he's going to support the Muslim population in New York, of course. And he's got a great answer to all this Israel baiting.
Yeah, and what's his answer?
Well, they always ask him, right, does Israel have a right to exist? I never heard him get asked, does Palestine have a right to exist? Does Iran have a right to exist? But he gets asked if Israel has a right to exist. And he just says, straightforwardly, it has a right to exist as a state with equal rights.
Right.
And so to then answer that very straightforward response, people would have to say, well, what about as a state not with equal rights? Because, of course, Israel is currently constituted, is not a state with equal rights. It's a state that privileges its Jewish citizens over anybody else. That's an instructive response, and this constant thing that's happening in the domestic debate. We should all learn from that.
From the left, you can't criticize it, right? People will say, well, does Israel have a right to exist? And some people will say, well, no, it doesn't. But in that same way, like the U.S. doesn't really.
The idea that states don't have rights to exist, that's not a right enshrined in international law. And I've always found that to be a confusing response, honestly.
Right now it sort of is what it is. And right, like the United States
does exist.
It does exist.
Israel does exist.
And it has also wiped out so much of the native population, the genocide. It's a settler colonial state.
And I think when people ask, does Israel have a right to exist, what they're implying and what they're worried about is a sort of a reverse genocide, that Israelis themselves will be cleansed from the land where they live, which is not something that anybody can support. I mean, just like we couldn't support the cleansing of all immigrants to the United States who aren't Native Americans. It's a reality that exists on the ground.
Mm-hmm. And so making those places where everybody can live with dignity and justice
and equal
rights, right? That's the answer. And his answer is a good one.
Yeah, I think it's a good one. On this Father's Day, I was actually revisiting a book that made a big impact on me and was written by Zohran's dad.
Yeah, Mahmoud Mamdani.
Mahmoud Mamdani. He was a really interesting guy. He's a political scientist who's of Indian heritage, but he grew up in East Africa in Uganda. And he wrote this great book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. It came out in 2004, so the year after Iraq. I think he wrote a lot of the book in response to W's war on terror, quote unquote, and the invasion of Afghanistan. And he was really answering this very popular interpretation of 9/11 and the political violence perpetrated by Muslims in particular. There was a popular idea out there of this clash of civilizations, a whole lot of nonsense, in my opinion, which he calls culture talk. Instead of that, what Mamdani writes about is the historical specificity. Where does the political violence of groups like Al-Qaeda come from? And we can also ask, where does the political violence of a group like Hamas come from? And they do come from specific places. And some of that history is internal to those movements themselves. That's complicated, that not everybody participating in Islamic political movements agrees with. In fact, most people do not. But there were sort of various forms, such as the radical Wahhabism that came out of the Muslim Brotherhood or certain parts of the Muslim Brotherhood that embraced a kind of political violence in response to the conditions they found, which in the case of Israel is a settler colonist settlers versus natives. But you find similar kinds of things in other places, colonies around the world. And he looks both at that internal structure, but also at late stage Cold War under Reagan, where the United States and Israel had a strategy of proxy wars because the United States wasn't able to commit ground troops after Vietnam for a long time because the people remembered there was a strong reflex against committing the United States military itself to conflicts. And so instead, they would use proxy forces. And they did this in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas, where they funded the Contras, who pursued a genocidal war within Nicaragua against peasants and other supporters of the Sandinistas. They also did this against the Russians in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And what they were doing is they were often building up religious-based, and in Afghanistan in particular, Islamic-based political groups against leftist secular governments like Russia, who was invading and occupying Afghanistan. So the Al-Qaeda actually comes directly from this late Cold War politics. Al-Qaeda was built up by the United States with the help of Israel and other allies. And inside of Palestine, Israel was building up Hamas as a way of undermining the secular nationalist Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, headed by Yasser Arafat. So anyway, so there's a history to political violence, and Zohran Mamdani's dad was all over. It's a great book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim.
That's a good recommendation.
Absolutely.
I'm also reading a great book right now. I'm not quite finished with, so I'm not ready to talk about it. But if you have a chance, pick up Genocide Bad by Sim Kern. It is a fabulous book. Sim writes about Jewish history, and they contextualize all of the Hasbara and kind of give you, the reader, a way of responding to it. And
Hasbara meaning?
Propaganda that comes out of Israel. So highly recommend that book.
All right. And maybe a preview of what's going to be coming on a future episode of Left Unsaid.
Hopefully so.
Well, this has been episode 10 of Left Unsaid. We made it into double digits.
Happy Father's Day,
Thank
Patrick.
you very much. Thank you very, very much.
Nothing you'd rather do than talk about Middle Eastern history on Father's Day.
That's right. That's right. Well, please come to the leftunsaid.net. Check out what we have to offer there. Tell your friends, tell your family, and we will come back at you in a week.
All right. See you next week.